In the early years of the 15th century, the small principality of Wallachia stood at a perilous crossroads of European and global history. Nestled in a landscape of dense forests, winding rivers, and rolling hills, this land was far more than a quiet geographic territory. It was a fiercely contested frontier. To the north and west lay powerful Christian kingdoms, including Hungary, whose rulers sought to expand their influence and protect the borders of Latin Christendom. To the south, across the broad waters of the Danube River, the Ottoman Empire was rising with relentless ambition, absorbing lands and pushing its borders ever deeper into the Balkans. Caught directly between these massive, competing imperial forces, Wallachia was forced to constantly navigate a dangerous path of diplomacy, tribute, and brief, desperate alliances to survive. It was into this volatile and shadow-filled world that Vlad Roman III was born. The exact year of his birth remains a matter of historical debate, but historians generally place it around the early 1430s, likely in the Transylvanian city of Siasora. At the time of his birth, his father, known to history as Vlad Roman II, was carving out a crucial and precarious position for himself within the complex political hierarchy of the region. The family belonged to the House of Basarab, a royal line that had long vied for control of the Wallachian throne. However, ruling Wallachia was rarely a peaceful endeavor. The principality was plagued by continuous internal instability, driven largely by rival noble factions known as boyars. These powerful landowners possessed immense local influence and private armies, and they frequently switched their allegiance between foreign powers, primarily Hungary and the Ottomans, to secure their own wealth and unseat inconvenient princes. For a young child entering this lineage, survival required an early and harsh education in the realities of political power. A defining moment for the family occurred shortly before or around the time of Vlad Roman III's birth, cementing a legacy that would echo down through the centuries. In 1431, Vlad's father was inducted into a prestigious chivalric fraternity known as the Order of the Dragon. Established by Sigismund of Luxembourg, the King of Hungary and future Holy Roman Emperor, the order was designed to unite selected European monarchs and nobles in a dedicated defense of Christianity against the encroaching Ottoman threat. Members of the order were granted the right to wear a distinctive badge featuring a dragon coiled into a circle, with a cross draped over its back. Because of this high honor, Vlad Roman II became widely known as Vlad Dracul, with the suffix Dracul deriving from the Latin word for dragon, Draco. In the Romanian language of the time, Dracul could mean both the dragon and, in later folk interpretations, a devil or evil spirit, but its original dynastic meaning was tied directly to this noble military brotherhood. When Vlad Roman III later took his own place in history, he inherited a version of this moniker, becoming known to his subjects and enemies alike as Dracula, meaning simply the son of the dragon. Growing up, Vlad Roman III absorbed the heavy atmosphere of this martial heritage. The family home was not merely a domestic space, but a stronghold where military strategy, political betrayal, and the constant threat of assassination were everyday topics of conversation. Wallachian princes had to be diplomats, commanders, and judges all at once, capable of placating aggressive foreign sultans one day and executing treacherous domestic nobles the next. The young Vlad learned early on that loyalty in the medieval Balkans was a rare commodity. He watched as his father shifted alliances out of sheer necessity, pledging fealty to the Hungarian crown when it offered protection, yet eventually paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan Murad Roman II when Ottoman armies proved too overwhelming to resist. These difficult compromises were not signs of weakness, but rather the stark survival tactics required of any small state squeezed between giants. The social fabric of Wallachia during Vlad's early years was defined by strict feudal hierarchies and deep-seated rivalries. The boyars held vast estates worked by dependent peasants, and their continuous infighting often destabilized the central government. Whenever a Wallachian prince tried to consolidate power, collect taxes, or build a unified defense force, the boyars would frequently rebel or invite foreign intervention to depose him. This constant cycle of coups, civil wars, and foreign invasions shaped the worldview of the ruling house. For Vlad Roman III, the world was inherently hostile, a place where weakness invited destruction, and where only absolute resolve could maintain a ruler on his throne. The lessons learned in the shadows of his father's court laid the foundational stone for a character that would later startle and terrify medieval Europe, transforming a minor frontier prince into a legendary figure of unrelenting strength and dark fascination. Building upon the foundations of a world steeped in political turbulence and constant peril, the young life of Vlad Roman III took shape within the fortified walls of his family's residences. As the son of Vlad Roman II Dracula, young Vlad found himself thrust onto a stage where childhood was remarkably brief, and the lessons of survival were taught through the immediate realities of medieval warfare and betrayal. The domestic sphere of a Wallachian prince was never truly isolated from the external pressures of the realm. Every room, every courtyard, and every hall echoed with whispered discussions of shifting loyalties, impending invasions, and the ever-present threat of assassination. For Vlad, growing up meant learning to read not only books or scholarly texts, but the subtle expressions, hidden motives, and dangerous intentions of the men who surrounded his father. Vlad Roman II Dracula faced an exceptionally difficult mandate during these formative years. Ruling Wallachia required walking a treacherous tightrope between two towering and hostile empires. To the south, the Ottoman Empire continued its relentless territorial expansion, demanding heavy tributes, military support, and absolute political deference from the small Christian states along its borders. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary, led by formidable monarchs and military commanders like Sigismund of Luxembourg and later John Hunniadi, watched Wallachia with suspicious eyes. The Hungarian court viewed Wallachia primarily as a strategic buffer zone, a protective shield designed to absorb the first wave of any Ottoman advance. If a Wallachian prince leaned too far toward the Ottomans to secure peace, he risked a devastating crusade from Hungary. If he allied too closely with Hungary, he invited swift and punishing retaliatory raids from the Ottoman armies across the Danube. This constant diplomatic balancing act consumed the daily life of Vlad's father, and the young prince absorbed these complex geopolitical pressures with every passing year. Within Wallachia itself, the domestic political landscape was equally fractured and perilous. The primary source of internal instability came from the boyars, the powerful noble families who owned vast tracts of land and commanded private armed retinues. These nobles possessed deep-rooted local influence, and frequently believed that their own interests superseded those of the centralized princely authority. Throughout Vlad's early childhood, the boyars engaged in constant political maneuvering, forming secret alliances, plotting coups, and orchestrating the deposition or murder of princes who attempted to limit their autonomy or tax their estates. The boyars were notorious for playing foreign powers against one another, turning to the Hungarian king or the Ottoman sultan whenever it suited their personal ambitions. Watching this ongoing internal struggle, Vlad learned a harsh and indelible lesson about human nature and governance. In a land plagued by treason, weakness was fatal, and authority could only be maintained through unyielding vigilance and absolute strength. Life in the princely court also exposed Vlad to the brutal realities of medieval military strategy and logistics. He grew up surrounded by armed guards, seasoned knights, and foreign emissaries. He observed councils of war where commanders debated the placement of troops, the fortification of mountain passes, and the procurement of weapons and armor. These were not theoretical exercises for distant battlefields. They concerned the immediate defense of their own homes and towns. Vlad was trained in the traditional martial arts of the nobility, learning horsemanship, swordplay, archery, and the tactical use of terrain. Wallachia's geography, characterized by thick forests, rugged hills, and marshy river valleys, offered natural defensive advantages, and the young prince was taught how to utilize these landscapes to counter larger invading forces. This early military education instilled in him a deep appreciation for tactical audacity and disciplined command, traits that would define his future military career. Despite the outward display of royal status, the family's position was inherently fragile. Vlad II Dracula was well aware that his title and life hung by a thread, dependent entirely on political expediency and military capability. Betrayal could come from the most unexpected quarters, including trusted advisors, extended family members, or nominal allies. This environment fostered a profound sense of isolation and wariness within the young Vlad. He discovered early on that true security was an illusion, and that survival demanded constant psychological readiness for conflict. The constant exposure to conspiracy and violence molded his character, hardening his emotional resilience, and preparing him for the immense burdens of leadership that he would later be forced to assume. The relationship between Vlad and his younger brother, Radu, also began to develop during these early years, though their paths would eventually diverge in dramatic and tragic ways. Growing up together in the shadow of their father's precarious reign, they shared the same atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Yet, the distinct ways in which they processed these formative experiences would later set them on opposing sides of history. While Vlad internalized a fierce, uncompromising determination to maintain Wallachian independence at all costs, Radu would eventually find a different accommodation with the changing geopolitical realities of the region. However, in these early days at the court of Vlad II Dracula, both brothers were simply pawns in a much larger, high-stakes game played by kings and sultans across Eastern Europe. The societal structure that Vlad observed daily was deeply hierarchical and stratified. Beyond the plotting, boyars and the armed retainers lay the vast majority of the population. Peasant farmers, herdsmen, and artisans who bore the heaviest economic burdens of the continuous wars. Crop failures, pillaging armies, and exorbitant taxation left the common people vulnerable to endless hardship. Vlad's father attempted to manage this fragile economy while simultaneously funding defense efforts, leading to widespread domestic discontent that the boyars were always eager to exploit. Witnessing the suffering of the populace and the callous indifference of self-serving nobles further shaped Vlad's worldview, reinforcing his later belief that extreme measures were required to impose order upon a chaotic society. As Vlad approached his adolescent years, the geopolitical storm clouds gathering over the Balkans grew increasingly dense. The delicate neutrality that Vlad II Dracula had strived to maintain was becoming mathematically impossible as the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad II prepared for a major push into southeastern Europe. The pressures from both east and west intensified, setting the stage for a critical turning point in the young prince's life. The lessons of his childhood, the sudden betrayals, the weight of dynastic duty, the brutal cost of warfare, and the constant threat of foreign domination, had thoroughly prepared him for the harsh realities of the medieval world, laying the psychological and strategic groundwork for the extraordinary and terrifying legacy of the dragon's son. Following the turbulent and precarious years spent within the fortified walls of his father's court, a devastating shift in the geopolitical chessboard of Eastern Europe thrust young Vlad and his younger brother, Radu, into an entirely new and harrowing reality. The delicate balancing act that Vlad II Dracula had attempted to maintain between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland finally collapsed under the relentless pressure of Sultan Murad II. For years, Vlad II had tried to appease both sides by offering token tributes and diplomatic assurances. But as Ottoman armies consolidated their dominance across the Balkans, neutrality ceased to be an option. In the winter of 1442, when Vlad II traveled to the Ottoman court to demonstrate his loyalty and negotiate terms, his precarious gamble backfired terribly. Rather than being received as an honored ally, the Wallachian prince and his two young sons were placed under arrest by the Sultan. This imprisonment was not merely a diplomatic detention. It was a calculated political maneuver designed to ensure the total obedience of Wallachia. Sultan Murad II understood that the most effective way to control a rebellious frontier principality was to hold its ruling bloodline hostage. While Vlad II was eventually permitted to return to Wallachia to resume his nominal rule, on the strict condition that he paid regular heavy tributes and sent his sons as permanent guarantees of his fidelity. The two boys remained behind in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. For teenage Vlad and his younger brother Radu, the glittering, sprawling city of Adrianople, the Ottoman capital at the time, became a gilded cage. They were thrust from the familiar pine forests and rugged hills of their homeland into an alien world of immense wealth, complex Islamic culture, and absolute imperial power. Life in the Ottoman court was a masterclass in psychological conditioning and statecraft. The brothers were housed within the vast palace complex alongside other noble hostages from conquered or subjugated lands across southeastern Europe. Here, they were educated in the sophisticated arts of the Ottoman elite. They were taught foreign languages, including Turkish and Arabic, studied theology, rhetoric, and philosophy, and were rigorously trained in horsemanship, archery, and advanced cavalry tactics. Yet, beneath the refined surface of courtly life, the constant undercurrent of danger and intimidation was never far away. Every day served as a stark reminder of their status as captives of a foreign monarch, whose empire was swallowing the medieval world piece by piece. For Vlad, this captivity was an intense crucible that forged his worldview, hardening his psychological resilience while deepening a profound, burning resentment toward those who held power over his life and his homeland. Observing the inner workings of the Ottoman military machine left a permanent mark on Vlad's understanding of governance and authority. He witnessed firsthand the terrifying efficiency, discipline, and absolute centralization of power commanded by the Sultan. In Wallachia, princely authority was constantly undermined by bickering boyars, shifting alliances, and weak institutions. In contrast, the Ottoman Empire operated as a seamless, disciplined juggernaut where orders from the top were executed without question, and where weakness in leadership was instantly punished. Vlad studied the Sultan's administrative methods, military logistics, and the unyielding control exercised over the populace and the military ranks. He saw how fear, order, and absolute obedience could stabilize a vast empire. lessons that he would later attempt to replicate in his own brutal fashion when he finally ascended the throne of Wallachia. While Vlad hardened his resolve and cultivated a fierce, unyielding independence during these captive years, his younger brother Radu experienced the exact opposite transformation. Radu, younger and more adaptable, began to integrate smoothly into the Ottoman court. He charmed the imperial courtiers, converted to Islam, and cultivated a close personal relationship with the Sultan's son, the future maimed Roman II. This divergence in the brothers' paths during captivity was momentous. While Vlad burned with a desire to escape, reclaim his birthright, and strike back against the empire that humiliated his family, Radu found a comfortable and advantageous future within the Ottoman structure. This growing emotional and ideological gulf between the two brothers foreshadowed the bitter civil conflicts that would later tear Wallachia apart, turning brother against brother in a desperate struggle for power. During these long years of exile, news from Wallachia frequently reached the brothers, bringing reports of further betrayal, foreign invasion, and domestic chaos. Vlad learned of his father's struggles to satisfy the Sultan's ever-increasing demands, the constant interference of Hungarian forces, and the treacherous assassinations orchestrated by rival noble factions. Knowing that his father and older brother, Mircea, were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds filled the young hostage with helpless fury. The realization that his family's survival depended entirely on the whims of a foreign sovereign created in Vlad an intense psychological trauma. He learned never to trust alliances built on convenience and to view diplomacy as a mere prelude to warfare. The years spent as a political hostage in the Ottoman court thus served as the ultimate finishing school for the future prince. It stripped away any remaining romantic illusions about medieval politics, replacing them with a cold, pragmatic understanding of power dynamics, military strategy, and the uses of terror. When Vlad was finally released from captivity following his father's death, he did not return to Wallachia as an innocent youth. He returned as a hardened, calculating observer of empires, carrying within his mind the strategies of the East and the burning ambition to restore his family's honor. The trauma and education of his hostage years ensured that when Vlad finally seized power, he would rule not as a hesitant noble, but as a ruthless prince, determined to ensure that Wallachia would never again bow its head in submission. The crisp autumn air of 1447 carried the unmistakable scent of blood and betrayal across the misty plains of Wallachia, marking the end of one troubled era and the violent beginning of another. For young Vlad, the news of his father's assassination and his eldest brother Mircea's brutal murder struck like a physical blow. Vlad Roman II, Dracula, had spent years walking a perilous tightrope between the expansive, hungry forces of the Ottoman Empire and the suspicious, aggressive Christian kingdoms of Hungary. Ultimately, that exhausting balancing act failed. A coalition of Wallachian boyars, the powerful local nobility who despised strong central authority, colluded with the regent of Hungary, John Hunyadi, to overthrow the ruling house. Vlad Roman II was cut down in the marshes near Targovist, while his oldest son Mircea was reportedly captured and buried alive by the vengeful boyars of Craiova. With these catastrophic deaths, the Wallachian throne stood vacant, and the principality was thrust into sudden, chaotic anarchy. For 17-year-old Vlad, the distant safety of the Ottoman court vanished instantly, replaced by a consuming, burning urge for vengeance and a desperate drive to reclaim his rightful heritage. The political landscape that greeted Vlad upon his return toward the borders of Wallachia was a treacherous labyrinth of shifting loyalties, backroom conspiracies, and armed factions. John Hunyadi, the formidable Hungarian military commander who had orchestrated the downfall of Vlad's father and brother, initially sought to stabilize the fractured principality by installing his own puppet ruler. Hunyadi placed Vladislav Roman II, a member of a rival branch of the House of Basarab, upon the Wallachian throne. Vladislav Roman II was expected to be a compliant instrument of Hungarian interests, keeping the turbulent buffer state firmly aligned with Hunyadi's crusading agenda against the Ottomans. To Hunyadi, Vlad was merely a troublesome remnant of a fallen dynasty, a potential pawn to be managed or neutralized. But Hunyadi severely underestimated the teenage prince's fierce intellect, unyielding resolve, and deep-seated network of loyal supporters hidden deep within the mountain strongholds of Wallachia. Vlad realized quickly that seizing the throne would require more than just a righteous claim. It demanded cold calculation, strategic opportunism, and absolute ruthlessness. The young prince spent months lingering near the borders, gathering intelligence, listening to disgruntled nobles who felt sidelined by the new regime, and studying the movements of Hunyadi's armies. The Ottoman Empire, too, was closely watching the chaos in Wallachia, sensing an opportunity to regain influence over the strategic borderlands. The Ottoman authorities provided covert encouragement and logistical backing to Vlad. They hoped that by supporting the son of Vlad Dracula, they could destabilize Hunyadi's puppet and restore pro-Ottoman stability to the principality. Caught between competing regional superpowers, Vlad learned his first profound lesson in sovereign survival. In the cutthroat politics of medieval Eastern Europe, alliances were merely temporary conveniences, and trust was a fatal luxury. The golden opportunity for Vlad's first bid for power arrived in the late summer of 1448. John Hunyadi, driven by his grand ambition to crush the Ottoman Empire, marched a massive Christian crusading army out of Hungary and deep into the Balkans, culminating in the disastrous Second Battle of Kosovo. With Hunyadi and the bulk of his elite forces deeply engaged far to the south, and with Vladislav Roman II away from the capital leading local contingents to support the Hungarian campaign, Wallachia was left largely undefended. Seeing his moment, Vlad acted with decisive speed. Backed by a small force of loyal retainers and troops supplied by the Ottoman governor of Silistra, Vlad crossed the Danube River and rode swiftly toward the princely court at Targovist. The capital, caught entirely off guard by the sudden strike, offered little resistance. The local garrisons, weary of constant instability and fluctuating taxes, melted away or swore allegiance to the returning son of the dragon. Within days, Vlad stood inside the princely palace, claiming the throne that rightfully belonged to his bloodline. Yet, sitting upon the throne proved to be vastly different from capturing it. Vlad's first reign in 1448 was remarkably brief, lasting a mere 2 months, but it served as a brutal, accelerated education in the mechanics of power. The young prince quickly discovered that the Wallachian boyars viewed princely authority not as a sacred institution to be respected, but as a temporary arrangement to be manipulated for personal gain. The noble council chambers hummed with whispered conspiracies, secret dispatches to rival claimants, and quiet plots to undermine the new ruler. Vlad attempted to assert his authority, issuing decrees, demanding loyalty oaths, and trying to secure the treasury. However, he lacked the military muscle and financial resources required to enforce his will across the entire principality. The boyars smiled to his face while sharpening their daggers behind his back, treating the teenage prince as an inexperienced interloper who could easily be brushed aside once the political winds shifted. The geopolitical reality outside Wallachia's borders soon crashed down upon Vlad's fragile victory. John Hunyadi, though defeated and humiliated at the Second Battle of Kosovo, managed to orchestrate a rapid retreat back toward Hungary. Furious to discover that his vassal state had been stolen by the son of his old enemy while he was fighting the Ottomans, Hunyadi turned his wrath northward. The formidable Hungarian commander mobilized his remaining forces and prepared to march back into Wallachia to restore Vladislav Roman II to power. For Vlad, the math of warfare was suddenly terrifyingly clear. He was vastly outnumbered. His internal support was crumbling as cowardly boyars rushed to abandon a losing cause, and his Ottoman benefactors were too far away to provide immediate reinforcements. Remaining in Targovist meant certain death or capture at the hands of the vengeful Hunyadi. Faced with overwhelming odds, Vlad made the strategic, pragmatic decision to abandon the capital before Hunyadi's vanguard reached the city gates. Rather than throwing away his life in a hopeless, suicidal defense of a throne he was not yet strong enough to hold, Vlad chose to retreat northward into the rugged, snow-dusted peaks of the Transylvanian mountains. He slipped away into exile, abandoning the princely palace just hours before Vladislav Roman II re-entered Targovist under the triumphant banners of Hungarian protection. To many observers, this swift collapse marked the end of Vlad's ambitions, proving that the teenage prince was simply too young and under-resourced to survive the brutal game of medieval thrones. Yet, this initial failure was far from a total defeat. It was a profound psychological turning point that permanently shaped Vlad's political philosophy. During his 2 fleeting months on the throne, he had witnessed the absolute treachery of the boyars, the fickle nature of popular support, and the terrifying reach of foreign powers. He realized that in a land plagued by betrayal, mercy was perceived as weakness, and hesitation was a death sentence. The experience stripped away any remaining youthful idealism, leaving behind a cold, calculating resolve. Vlad understood that to rule Wallachia and survive, he could never again rely on fragile loyalties or temporary arrangements. When he would eventually return to claim his crown for good, he swore he would rule not by winning the love of his nobles, but by commanding their absolute, unyielding terror. The return of Vlad Roman III to the throne of Wallachia in 1456 marked a profound turning point in the history of the principality, ushering in an era defined by an unyielding quest for absolute order. Having survived years of exile, political manipulation, and constant peril, the prince who re-entered Targovist was no longer an idealistic youth testing the waters of sovereignty. He was a hardened strategist bearing the deep psychological scars of betrayal and displacement. Vlad understood intimately that the greatest threat to Wallachia's survival did not merely lurk beyond its borders in the camps of the Ottoman sultans or the royal courts of Hungary. It festered deep within the domestic heart of the country, housed inside the fortified manors of the boyars. These powerful nobles had spent decades treating the princely throne as a revolving door, elevating and deposing rulers at their whim, while plunging the common folk into endless cycles of civil war, economic ruin, and social lawlessness. To save Wallachia from tearing itself apart, Vlad resolved to dismantle the independent power of the nobility entirely, replacing the fragile rule of aristocratic consensus with the unbending, centralized authority of a sovereign prince. The friction between Vlad and the Wallachian boyars began immediately upon his consolidation of power, as the prince moved swiftly to reassert control over the state's administration, land distribution, and judicial system. The boyars, accustomed to enjoying sweeping privileges, tax exemptions, and immunity from royal justice under previous weak rulers, viewed Vlad's decrees as an intolerable assault on their traditional rights. They attempted to use their wealth, local retinues, and family connections to quietly obstruct his policies, believing that the young prince would eventually tire or be forced to compromise. However, Vlad's approach to governance left no room for negotiation or political maneuvering. He demanded absolute loyalty, prompt tax collection, strict enforcement of laws, and complete subordination to the crown. Every act of defiance, every whispered conspiracy, and every sign of divided allegiance was met not with diplomatic warning, but with swift and devastating consequence. The princely council chamber, once a noisy arena of aristocratic debate and factional plotting, became a silent, tense environment where obedience was the sole condition for survival. To enforce this new reality across a fragmented and lawless realm, Vlad recognized that ordinary judicial mechanisms were entirely inadequate. The local courts were corrupt, biased, and heavily influenced by powerful local lords who could easily bribe judges or intimidate witnesses. Vlad took the administration of justice directly into his own hands, establishing himself as the supreme, unchallengeable arbiter of right and wrong within his borders. He instituted rigorous laws aimed at restoring commercial security, combating theft, and protecting the peasantry and merchants from the predatory abuses of the nobility. According to historical accounts and contemporary chronicles, Vlad's pursuit of honesty and order became legendary. Foreign merchants visiting Wallachia noted that items of immense value could be left unattended in the open streets without fear of theft, knowing that the punishment for any criminal offense was absolute and unsparing. Yet, this domestic security was purchased at an immense psychological cost, as the punishments meted out by the prince grew increasingly severe, shifting away from standard medieval fines or imprisonment toward terrifying, public demonstrations of state power designed to permanently cow both criminal elements and political rivals. The boyars, increasingly desperate as they watched their ancient political dominance slip away, began to organize secret meetings to plan Vlad's overthrow, reaching out once more to foreign allies in Hungary and Transylvania to secure backing for a coup. But Vlad's intelligence network throughout Wallachia was exceptionally effective, capturing whispers of treason before they could materialize into open rebellion. Rather than waiting for an armed uprising to catch him off guard, the prince struck first with a calculated, theatrical brutality that permanently shattered the morale of the aristocracy. He invited a large gathering of prominent boyars and their families to a grand feast in Targovist under the guise of reconciliation and state business. As the banquet progressed and the guests let down their guard, Vlad confronted them directly with their treachery, accusing them of destroying the unity of the realm through their endless civil wars and secret foreign intrigues. Before the terrified nobles could react or mount a defense, his loyal guards seized the conspirators, while the older and more compromised boyars were immediately subjected to harsh, unforgiving labor and public execution. This decisive blow effectively decapitated the leadership of the internal opposition, sending a shockwave through the remaining aristocracy that made any future organized resistance nearly impossible. The consolidation of central authority also transformed the social and economic fabric of Wallachia, tying the peasantry more closely to the land, while simultaneously demanding their active participation in the defense of the state. Vlad understood that a strong economy and a reliable military force were essential for resisting external pressure from the Ottoman Empire, which was closely watching the internal stabilization of the principality with growing unease. By eliminating the petty infighting of the boyars and securing trade routes, Vlad filled the princely treasury and began organizing a more disciplined, responsive military apparatus. The common people, though terrified of the prince's ruthless methods and unforgiving justice, found a strange measure of security in a land free from the arbitrary violence of roaming noble gangs and greedy local lords. Through these drastic and unyielding measures, Vlad successfully forged a unified, obedient state out of a fractured borderland, laying the groundwork for the monumental military confrontations that would soon define his legacy as a prince who refused to bow to any earthly power, building directly upon the brutal subjugation of the rebellious boyars and the total consolidation of his autocratic rule. Vlad Roman III cemented a legacy that would echo across the centuries through the methodical and terrifying use of public punishment. While contemporary chronicles and foreign accounts from travelers, German merchants, and papal legates frequently clash over the exact motivations and scale of his actions, they universally agree on the primary instrument of his statecraft: impalement. To the prince, this specific method of execution was not merely a random display of sadistic fury, but a calculated geopolitical tool, a psychological weapon, and an extreme judicial deterrent designed to enforce absolute compliance in a lawless frontier realm caught between collapsing regional powers. By transforming public squares, rural crossroads, and border approaches into grim stages of state authority, Vlad sought to broadcast a singular, inescapable message to internal traitors and external enemies alike. The sheer scale of these displays eventually earned him the grim and permanent epithet by which he is known today: Vlad the Impaler. To understand why impalement became the cornerstone of Vlad's penal system, one must examine the chaotic realities of 15th-century Wallachia, where traditional legal structures had completely collapsed under decades of civil war and aristocratic infighting. Simple fines, brief imprisonments, or standard executions carried out by local lords held no terror for a hardened nobility accustomed to bloodshed, or for hardened criminal syndicates operating across unguarded trade routes. Vlad needed a deterrent so absolute, so psychologically overwhelming, and so profoundly feared that it would permanently eradicate crime and treason from his lands. Impalement, a practice with ancient roots across various cultures and military traditions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, involved driving a greased wooden stake through the victim's body in a manner calculated to avoid immediate vital organs, thereby prolonging life and maximizing psychological impact. For the prince, it served as a brutal equalizer that applied to everyone equally. Corrupt merchants who cheated the poor, thieves who disrupted commerce, foreign spies, and high-ranking nobles who conspired against the crown found themselves subjected to the exact same merciless standard of justice. The historical record regarding these events is preserved largely through two distinct and often competing perspectives: local oral traditions that viewed the prince as a harsh protector of the common people, and foreign propaganda pamphlets printed in German cities that depicted him as a bloodthirsty monster. German broadsheets, mass-produced following the invention of the printing press, eagerly seized upon sensationalized accounts of Vlad's punishments to portray him as a tyrant who slaughtered thousands in bizarre and cruel spectacles. Modern historical analysis, however, requires careful separation of documented geopolitical events from sensationalized fiction and wartime propaganda. While foreign merchants and political enemies had clear motivations to exaggerate his cruelty, to justify military interventions or trade embargoes, contemporary diplomatic dispatches and court records confirm that Vlad used mass terror strategically, most notably during campaigns against rival claimants, rebellious towns, and Ottoman raiding parties. One of the most famous and widely cited episodes illustrating this policy occurred during Vlad's ongoing conflicts with the Saxon merchants of Transylvanian border towns, particularly Brasov and Sibiu, who frequently harbored his political rivals and levied economic blockades against Wallachia. In retaliation for their defiance and subversion, Vlad launched swift retaliatory raids across the mountains, capturing political prisoners, rebellious citizens, and suspected collaborators. According to numerous accounts from the period, upon returning to Wallachia, or outside the walls of the rebellious towns, hundreds or even thousands of victims were subjected to impalement, arranged in rigid geometric formations such as concentric circles outside city gates. This chilling architectural display of execution, often referred to by later chroniclers as the Forest of the Impaled, served a dual purpose. It terrified invading armies by demonstrating the horrific fate awaiting captured enemies, and it sent an unmistakable warning to any neighboring city contemplating an alliance against the Wallachian prince. Beyond its utility as a military deterrent, Vlad used theatrical punishments to enforce a strict moral code and civil order among the general populace. Stories recorded by chroniclers of the era describe how the prince would place a golden chalice filled with coins in a public square in Targovist, inviting travelers and impoverished citizens to drink and use the gold, knowing with absolute certainty that no one would dare steal it for fear of the immediate, unsparing consequences. While these anecdotes frequently border on folk legend, they reflect a core historical truth about Vlad's reign. Safety on the roads and honesty in commerce were strictly maintained through the omnipresent threat of capital punishment. Beggars, vagrants, and the idle poor were occasionally gathered under the pretext of a great feast and burned alive, with the prince explaining that he did so to eliminate poverty and ease the economic burden on the industrious taxpayers of the realm. While such logic appears horrifyingly callous to modern sensibilities, in the brutal calculus of the 15th century, it was viewed by some contemporaries as an extreme manifestation of righteous governance. The psychological fallout of these public spectacles extended far beyond Wallachia's borders, eventually reaching the highest courts of Europe and the tent of the Ottoman Sultan. Maimed Roman II, the ambitious conqueror of Constantinople, began to receive detailed reports regarding the prince who ruled north of the Danube, a ruler who not only refused to pay the traditional annual tribute, but who displayed captured Ottoman scouts and raiding parties in horrifying arrays along the frontier. This psychological warfare was intentionally designed to erode the morale of the Sultan's commanders before a major campaign could even begin. Yet, relying so heavily on terror as a primary instrument of governance carried severe, long-term political risks. It alienated the remaining nobility, created deep-seated panic among the common folk who could never feel entirely safe from the prince's mercurial wrath, and provided his enemies with an endless supply of ammunition for propaganda campaigns. By cultivating a reputation as a merciless avenger who ruled through terror, Vlad ensured that his name would never be forgotten, even as the geopolitical storm clouds gathered on the southern horizon, and the might of the Ottoman Empire prepared to march, building directly upon the chilling psychological atmosphere established by his campaigns of terror. Vlad Roman III's defiance soon escalated from domestic consolidation to an inevitable, full-scale confrontation with the most formidable military power in 15th-century Europe, the Ottoman Empire. For years, the rulers of Wallachia had navigated a treacherous diplomatic tightrope, formally acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty while quietly seeking alliances with Christian kingdoms to the north. However, Vlad's ascent to power, and his uncompromising drive for absolute sovereignty made continued appeasement impossible. The tipping point arrived when Vlad boldly refused to pay the traditional annual tribute, known as the harras, and halted the delivery of young men intended for the Ottoman Janissary Corps. By cutting off financial and military compliance, the Wallachian prince threw down a direct gauntlet to Sultan Mehmed Roman II, the ambitious conqueror who had famously breached the ancient walls of Constantinople just a few years prior. Mehmed, accustomed to the swift submission of regional princes, viewed Vlad's rebellion not merely as a localized tax dispute, but as an intolerable affront to imperial authority that demanded an immediate and overwhelming response. The tension escalated dramatically when the Sultan dispatched envoys to Wallachia to demand compliance and personal submission from the wayward prince. According to historical chronicles, these envoys either refused or neglected to remove their traditional headwear in the presence of the Wallachian ruler, citing custom, to which Vlad responded with characteristic brutality by having their turbans nailed directly to their heads before executing them. Knowing full well that this act of defiance would unleash the full wrath of the Porte, Vlad did not wait passively behind his fortifications. In the winter of 1461 and 1462, he launched a massive preemptive strike across the frozen Danube River into Ottoman territory in northern Bulgaria. Leading his cavalry through freezing weather and nighttime blizzards, Vlad ravaged Ottoman garrison towns, destroyed supply depots, and slaughtered tens of thousands of enemy combatants and Muslim settlers. Letters written by Vlad himself during this period boast of staggering casualty figures, emphasizing his intent to bring the terror of war directly to the Sultan's doorstep and shatter the illusion of Ottoman invincibility along the frontier. Faced with such an audacious provocation, Sultan Mehmed Roman II began assembling one of the largest invasion forces of the era. Contemporary estimates, likely inflated by chroniclers but reflective of the sheer scale of the mobilization, suggested an Ottoman army numbering anywhere from 90,000 to over 200,000 elite troops, supported by a powerful river fleet and heavy siege artillery. This vast imperial host dwarfed the meager military resources of Wallachia, a small and impoverished principality whose standing army numbered only a fraction of the Sultan's forces. Realizing that meeting the Ottoman juggernaut in a traditional pitched battle would result in swift and total annihilation, Vlad adopted a strategy of asymmetric warfare, scorched earth, and psychological devastation. As Mehmed's grand army crossed the Danube and marched inland toward the Wallachian capital of Targovist, they encountered an eerie, deserted wasteland. Vlad had ordered the complete evacuation of all villages, the systematic burning of crops and granaries, the poisoning of water wells, and the diversion of rivers to create treacherous swamps across the invading army's path. For days, the proud Ottoman host stumbled through a hostile, empty wilderness under the relentless harassment of Wallachian guerrilla archers and cavalry raiders who struck from the safety of the dense forests before melting away into the hills. Frustrated by the lack of provisions, plagued by thirst, and suffering from outbreaks of disease, the morale of Mehmed's soldiers began to plummet. To exacerbate their psychological torment, Vlad deployed captured scouts and minor commanders who had been subjected to public execution, transforming the borderlands into a harrowing theater of war. Yet, despite the clever use of terrain and terror, the sheer momentum of the Ottoman advance could not be halted by guerrilla tactics alone. As Mehmed's legions pushed deeper into the heart of Wallachia, drawing closer to Targovist, the conflict reached a critical breaking point, setting the stage for a daring nighttime confrontation that would forever immortalize Vlad's military audacity in the annals of medieval history. The darkness of the June night in 1462 wrapped tightly around the vast, sprawling Ottoman encampment situated along the banks of the Argeș River. For weeks, Sultan Mehmed Roman II and his massive imperial host had marched deeper into the heart of Wallachia, expecting to encounter the main body of the enemy army in a decisive, honorable field battle. Instead, the invaders had found themselves ghost hunting through an empty, scorched landscape, plagued by thirst, hunger, and the invisible strikes of Wallachian guerrilla fighters. Now, the enormous camp stretched out for miles under the open sky, illuminated by the flickering light of thousands of campfires. Thousands of tents, ranging from the ornate and silken pavilions of high-ranking commanders and pashas, down to the simple canvas shelters of ordinary janissaries and foot soldiers, dotted the rolling hills and river valleys. The horses were tethered in long lines, and the heavy siege artillery rested quietly, waiting for the dawn when the march toward Targovist would resume. Deep within this sprawling labyrinth of tents, the Supreme Sultan himself rested inside his magnificent imperial pavilion. Mehmed Roman II, the conqueror of Constantinople, felt confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, even though his army had suffered from the psychological terror tactics of Vlad Roman III and the grueling scorched earth policy. He believed that the Wallachian prince was entirely cornered, reduced to running and hiding in the shadows of the Carpathian Mountains. The guards on duty maintained a standard level of watchfulness, but the sheer scale of the camp made it impossible to secure every single approach against a completely unexpected threat. The vast sea of humanity was lulled into a false sense of security by the vastness of their own numbers, underestimating the desperate daring of a prince who had nothing left to lose. That calculated sense of security was shattered in an instant when Vlad the Impaler launched his legendary night attack. Under the cover of pitch-black darkness, Vlad led a carefully selected force of his most elite cavalrymen directly into the heart of the Ottoman camp. Choosing the point of entry with chilling precision, the Wallachian raiders slipped past the outer perimeter without raising a general alarm, moving like phantoms through the deep shadows between the canvas pavilions. They did not come to fight a prolonged, structured battle. Their mission was pure, concentrated disruption, confusion, and psychological warfare. As they charged deep into the interior lanes of the encampment, chaos erupted instantly. War horns blared into the night air, battle cries shattered the quiet, and the thunder of hooves shook the earth beneath the sleeping soldiers' feet. The element of surprise was absolute and devastating. Awakened from deep sleep by sudden violence, Ottoman soldiers stumbled out of their tents into absolute confusion. In the darkness, friend could not be distinguished from foe. Janissaries and irregular infantry grabbed their weapons and began shouting conflicting orders, while panic spread like wildfire from one end of the camp to the other. To maximize the chaos, Vlad's men set fire to several key supply tents and storage depots, casting leaping orange flames across the night sky and silhouetting the frantic crowds running in every direction. Horses broke free from their tethers, trampling through the temporary shelters and adding to the roaring pandemonium. The massive Ottoman host, numbering in the tens of thousands, was effectively paralyzed not by enemy steel, but by sheer disorientation and panic. Amidst the howling wind, the clashing of weapons, and the roar of the spreading fires, Vlad and his hand-picked guard pushed aggressively toward the center of the camp, zeroing in on the most magnificent tent of all, the imperial pavilion of Sultan Mehmed Roman II. According to historical accounts, the Wallachian prince and his men fought their way close enough to threaten the supreme ruler directly, cutting down elite guards who rushed to form a defense. The objective was breathtakingly audacious: to eliminate the Sultan himself in a single, lightning-fast strike, thereby decapitating the Ottoman war machine in one stroke and forcing the entire invading army into a disorganized retreat. For a brief, terrifying span of minutes, the fate of the entire Ottoman Empire hung in the balance within that smoke-filled clearing. Yet, the sheer size of the camp and the resolute bravery of Mehmed's personal bodyguards ultimately prevented total disaster for the invaders. Realizing that the tent they had breached belonged not to the Sultan himself, but to two of his highest-ranking viziers, Isaac and Mahmud, Vlad's men inflicted massive casualties on the confusion-stumbled defenders before the elite Janissaries could fully rally and form a solid wall of steel. Recognizing that the initial shock had achieved its maximum psychological effect, and that lingering longer would mean being surrounded by overwhelming numbers, Vlad issued the order to withdraw. As quickly as they had materialized from the dark wilderness, the Wallachian cavalry melted back into the night, slipping across the river and vanishing safely into the surrounding hills before the Ottoman army could organize a counteroffensive. When the first gray light of dawn broke over the Arges River valley, the true toll of the night attack became chillingly clear. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead, many having accidentally killed one another in the panicked darkness, while valuable supplies and tents had been reduced to ash. Sultan Mehmed Roman II surveyed the smoking ruins of his camp with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect for his cunning adversary. The raid did not permanently stop the Ottoman invasion, but it proved that Vlad was a military commander of extraordinary daring and tactical brilliance. The night attack permanently cemented Vlad's reputation as a master of asymmetric warfare, a terrifying ghost prince who could strike fear into the heart of the most powerful empire in the medieval world. The smoke from the burning campfires along the Arges River slowly cleared, but the profound shock of the night attack lingered heavily within the Ottoman military ranks. Sultan Mehmed Roman II had survived the daring assault, yet the psychological wound inflicted by Vlad Roman III ran deep. For weeks, the Sultan's vast army had marched through Wallachia expecting a swift and straightforward conquest, only to find themselves trapped in a grueling campaign of psychological terror, scorched earth, and sudden, blinding violence. However, military campaigns in medieval Europe were shaped not only by battlefield clashes, but by the fragile loyalties of nobility, the weight of economic exhaustion, and the relentless pressure of rival political factions. As the summer of 1462 progressed, the tide began to turn against Vlad, not entirely through the might of Ottoman steel, but through the shifting allegiances of his own people and the strategic maneuvers of his enemies. Following the night attack, Vlad realized that maintaining a prolonged open war against the full might of the Ottoman Empire was unsustainable for a small, economically vulnerable principality like Wallachia. While his guerrilla tactics and the daring raid had caused massive disruption and bruised the pride of the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed Roman II possessed nearly limitless resources, manpower, and supplies. When units regrouped and pushed further inland toward the capital of Targovist, they encountered a desolate landscape where wells had been poisoned, crops burned, and livestock hidden away. Yet, the sheer cost of this defensive strategy weighed heavily on the local population. Peasants and lower-class citizens, who bore the ultimate burden of starvation, displacement, and continuous warfare, began to question whether their prince's uncompromising defiance would bring total destruction rather than salvation. Crucially, the Wallachian boyars, the powerful noble families who had long resented Vlad's ruthless consolidation of central authority and his brutal punishments of suspected traitors, saw an opening to reclaim their lost influence. Throughout his reign, Vlad had systematically undermined the traditional privileges of the aristocracy, executing nobles who crossed him and replacing them with loyal servants drawn from lower social strata or foreign allies. These disaffected boyars had never fully accepted Vlad's iron-fisted rule. As the Ottoman pressure mounted, and the economic situation grew increasingly desperate, secret communications began to circulate among the elite. They reasoned that continuing to support a prince at war with the most powerful empire in the region would lead to the complete annexation and devastation of Wallachia. Seeking a safer path, influential noble factions began looking toward alternative leadership, someone more pliable, more willing to compromise with foreign powers, and less inclined to use the stake to solve political disagreements. Enter Radu, known historically as Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother. Unlike Vlad, who had spent his formative years hardening his resolve against captivity and fighting for absolute independence, Radu had spent a significant portion of his youth as a political hostage at the Ottoman court in Edirne. During those years, Radu had cultivated close personal relationships with the Ottoman elite, eventually earning the favor of Sultan Mehmed Roman II himself. He had adopted the language, culture, and diplomatic manners of the Ottoman court, making him an entirely different kind of political figure compared to his stern, unyielding older brother. Recognizing Radu's potential utility, the Ottoman administration decided to back him as a rival claimant to the Wallachian throne. By supporting Radu, Mehmed Roman II could secure a compliant ruler in Wallachia without needing to commit endless troops to a bloody, protracted occupation of the Carpathian Mountains. The Ottoman strategy relied heavily on political subversion alongside military pressure. As Mehmed Roman II's army advanced, emissaries and agents worked quietly behind the scenes, contacting dissatisfied boyars and local leaders with a clear message. Peace, stability, and restored privileges awaited those who abandoned Vlad and threw their support behind Radu. For many nobles exhausted by years of internal purges and external invasions, the promise of an alternative leader backed by Ottoman guarantees proved deeply tempting. Step by step, local lords began to shift their allegiances, quietly opening communications with Radu and refusing to supply or reinforce Vlad's remaining loyal troops. The unity that Vlad had enforced through fear and strict discipline began to fracture from within, proving that even the most formidable fortress could be hollowed out from the inside. Vlad found himself facing an increasingly isolated political landscape. Not only were Ottoman forces pressing forward from the south, but his own domestic support network was rapidly eroding. Towns and fortified settlements that had previously obeyed his commands began to hesitate or outright close their gates to his messengers. The boyars, operating in small factions, began actively plotting against him, coordinating with Radu's advancing entourage. In medieval Wallachia, power was inextricably linked to the personal loyalty of the armed retinue and the backing of the landed nobility. Without reliable internal support, even a brilliant tactician and fearless commander like Vlad could not hold the principality together against simultaneous external invasion and internal rebellion. The final push of the campaign saw Radu advancing through Wallachia, accompanied by Ottoman detachments and a growing number of defecting Wallachian nobles. As towns surrendered or shifted their allegiance to the younger brother, Vlad's sphere of control shrank dramatically. He was forced to retreat northward toward the rugged terrain of the Carpathian Mountains, traditional territory for regrouping, but far away from the fertile agricultural centers and political hubs of the south. The transition of power was remarkably swift. The very nobles who had once bowed out of terror now welcomed Radu into Targovist, eager to restore the old aristocratic privileges that Vlad had dismantled. This dramatic shift marked a turning point in Vlad's tumultuous career. The domestic betrayal was particularly bitter, demonstrating the limits of terror as a permanent instrument of political unification. While fear had allowed Vlad to keep the boyars in check during times of relative strength, it failed to create deep loyalty when the tide turned against him. The kingdom he had fought so fiercely to protect and centralize had ultimately turned its back on him, choosing the diplomatic compromise of his Ottoman-backed brother over the uncompromising defiance of the Impaler. As Radu consolidated his position on the throne, Vlad was pushed out of Wallachia entirely, setting the stage for a long, cold chapter of exile, captivity, and political maneuvering across the borders of Hungary. The transition from a reigning prince of Wallachia to a captive in a foreign land was a bitter and sudden descent for Vlad Roman III. Stripped of his crown, his lands, and his loyal retinue, Vlad found himself crossing the border into the Kingdom of Hungary, seeking sanctuary and political backing from King Matthias Corvinus. Vlad believed that a Christian monarch would welcome a seasoned warrior who had fought fiercely against the Ottoman Empire, hoping to secure Hungarian military aid to reclaim his throne from his brother Radu. However, medieval European politics were governed less by shared religious ideals and more by cold, calculating pragmatism. Matthias Corvinus, eager to secure financial support from the Pope and European powers for his own military campaigns, and wary of the extreme reputation preceding the Wallachian prince, chose a very different path. Instead of receiving an alliance, Vlad was betrayed by the very king he sought help from, plunging him into a long and grueling period of captivity. The exact nature of Vlad's imprisonment and the reasons behind Matthias Corvinus's actions have long been a subject of intense discussion among historians. To understand why Matthias turned against Vlad, one must examine the complex geopolitical web of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1460s. King Matthias was attempting to balance multiple competing pressures. On one hand, he needed to appear as a champion of Christendom, fighting against the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire led by Sultan Mehmed Roman II. On the other hand, maintaining an alliance with a ruler as controversial, unpredictable, and internationally infamous as Vlad carried immense diplomatic risks. European courts were already flooded with terrifying stories regarding Vlad's harsh methods of maintaining order. Stories that had been vigorously amplified by hostile Saxon merchants from Transylvania, who had suffered under Vlad's strict economic policies and trade restrictions. Matthias needed to justify his past financial expenditures and secure new funds from Rome, and associating too closely with a prince labeled by his enemies as a monster could damage the Hungarian king's reputation. Furthermore, King Matthias faced pressure from his own political rivals and nobility, many of whom viewed Vlad with deep suspicion. To placate critics, reassure the Pope that he was handling dangerous elements responsibly, and neutralize any independent military actions that might complicate Hungary's fragile peace treaties with the Ottomans, Matthias made a calculated political choice. Instead of treating Vlad as an honored royal guest or an active military ally, the Hungarian king had him arrested and detained. The arrest occurred in late 1462, marking the beginning of a captivity that would last for over a decade. While Vlad was initially held under relatively secure conditions, the psychological weight of imprisonment must have been staggering for a man whose entire life had been defined by relentless action, sovereign command, and the defense of his homeland's borders. During the early years of his confinement, Vlad was moved to Visegrad, a prominent royal castle situated high above the Danube River in Hungary. While Visegrad was a grand Renaissance palace rather than a crude, dark dungeon of popular myth, captivity remained captivity. Vlad was cut off from the outside world, denied the ability to influence events in Wallachia, and forced to watch from afar as his brother Radu firmly entrenched Ottoman authority in his former principality. Yet, the period of imprisonment was not merely a time of quiet isolation. It was also a crucible in which the historical record of Vlad's reign was actively reshaped, distorted, and weaponized by his enemies. It was during Vlad's years in Hungarian custody that the infamous German pamphlets and stories detailing his alleged atrocities began to circulate wildly across European printing presses. In an era when the newly invented printing press was revolutionizing the spread of information, sensationalist tales sold exceptionally well. Saxon merchants and political detractors in Transylvania, eager to justify Matthias's imprisonment of Vlad and to punish the former prince for his past trade crackdowns, produced a flurry of vivid, terrifying accounts. These stories depicted Vlad as a bloodthirsty tyrant who slaughtered thousands of people indiscriminately, committed bizarre acts of cruelty, and reveled in human suffering. While many of these accounts were blatant propaganda, exaggerations, or entirely fictional folk tales adapted to fit a moralizing narrative, they were presented as undeniable truths to European readers. King Matthias himself had a vested interest in allowing these narratives to circulate. By painting Vlad as a dangerous and unstable criminal, Matthias could justify to foreign powers why a Christian king was holding a fellow Christian prince in captivity, instead of helping him fight the Ottomans. If Vlad was perceived as a madman rather than a legitimate, wronged sovereign, Matthias's political maneuvering appeared much more defensible. Consequently, the historical record from this period became heavily skewed, blending kernels of genuine historical severity, such as Vlad's documented executions of rebellious boyars and invading Ottoman soldiers, with wild, supernatural adjacent exaggerations that laid the groundwork for future folklore. Despite the indignity of imprisonment, Vlad was not entirely forgotten, nor was he completely powerless in the realm of long-term diplomacy. Over the years, as political conditions in Europe shifted and tensions between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire fluctuated, the utility of Vlad as a political chess piece began to change. Matthias Corvinus eventually realized that a pliable, experienced military commander like Vlad could still be useful if the Ottoman threat grew too large to ignore. As time passed, the strictness of Vlad's confinement eased, and he was eventually moved to Pest, where he lived under house arrest and even married a member of the Hungarian royal family, demonstrating that he retained a degree of high-status recognition. The years of captivity served as a profound pause in an otherwise violently turbulent life. While Radu ruled Wallachia under Ottoman suzerainty, and the European printing presses churned out increasingly fantastical stories about the cruel prince of the Carpathians, Vlad waited in the background. The accusations leveled against him during this time created a legendary shadow that would long outlive the man himself, transforming a medieval political struggle into a permanent fixture of European imagination. Yet, beneath the layers of propaganda and royal imprisonment, the core of Vlad's fierce independence remained unbroken, setting the stage for one final, desperate attempt to reclaim his lost throne when the political winds of Europe shifted once again. The long years of imprisonment, political isolation, and marriage into the fringes of the Hungarian royal court had fundamentally changed the external circumstances of Vlad III life. but they had done nothing to extinguish his fierce desire to reclaim his homeland. For over a decade, Wallachia had remained under the shadow of Ottoman dominance, ruled first by his pliable brother Radu, and subsequently by other princes who bowed to the demands of Sultan Mehmed Roman II. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, Wallachia was a strategic buffer zone, a crucial frontier where a strong ruler could disrupt Ottoman supply lines and protect the borders of Hungary and Transylvania. Yet, European monarchs had long hesitated to trust Vlad, swayed by the negative propaganda generated by Saxon merchants and the political convenience of King Matthias Corvinus. As the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe shifted in the mid-1470s, however, the calculus of power began to change once more, opening a narrow and dangerous window of opportunity for the exiled prince. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed Roman II was expanding its reach with alarming speed, threatening not only smaller principalities like Wallachia and Moldavia, but also major regional powers such as Hungary and Venice. King Matthias Corvinus found himself facing mounting pressure from the papacy and neighboring states to mount a serious, coordinated defense against the Turkish advance. In this tense environment, Matthias recognized that keeping a proven and ruthless military commander like Vlad locked away in Hungary served little strategic purpose when the Ottoman threat was reaching a critical boiling point. Furthermore, political alignments within Wallachia itself were beginning to fracture. The reigning prince, Basarab Leota, who had initially come to power with Ottoman backing, proved increasingly unreliable to the Sultan while failing to secure the loyalty of the local Wallachian boyars. Discontent was spreading among the nobility and common folk alike, many of whom remembered the iron-fisted order and fierce independence of Vlad's earlier reign, with a strange mix of lingering dread and nostalgic longing for stability. Seizing upon these changing winds, King Matthias Corvinus altered his stance toward his former captive. Rather than viewing Vlad as a political liability to be contained, Matthias decided to utilize him as a weapon against the Ottomans. The release of Vlad was not an act of royal benevolence or forgiveness, but rather a cold, pragmatic military calculation. Matthias agreed to support Vlad's bid to retake the throne of Wallachia, providing him with a contingent of Hungarian and Transylvanian troops, alongside financial backing to help launch a military campaign. For Vlad, this was the moment he had waited for through more than a decade of captivity, house arrest, and frustration. He accepted the terms, knowing full well that an alliance with Matthias was fragile and transactional, but recognizing that it was his only viable pathway back to the throne of his ancestors. The final return of Vlad Roman III to the political stage began in the autumn and winter of 1475, backed by Hungarian forces commanded by Bathri István and supported by troops from Stephen Roman III of Moldavia, who was another fierce opponent of Ottoman expansion. Vlad marched toward the borders of Wallachia. The campaign was designed to exploit the weaknesses in Basarab Leota's administration and rally anti-Ottoman elements within the principality. As Vlad's army crossed the border, the political climate inside Wallachia grew intensely volatile. Local nobles, caught between the competing demands of the approaching Vlad, the reigning prince, and the looming shadow of the Ottoman Sultan, faced a dangerous choice. Some boyars, fearful of Vlad's legendary vengeance and remembering the purges of his first two reigns, hastily organized defenses or fled to seek Ottoman reinforcements. Others, desperate for a strong leader who could push back against heavy Ottoman tribute demands and foreign interference, quietly signaled their willingness to switch sides and support the returning prince. The military operation to reclaim Wallachia was swift and hard-fought. Vlad's coalition forces, bolstered by his own tactical experience and deep familiarity with the rugged terrain of the Carpathians, managed to capture key strongholds and push back Basarab Leota's loyalists. By late 1475 and early 1476, Vlad had succeeded in re-establishing his authority in significant portions of the principality, forcing his rival to flee or seek immediate military assistance from Istanbul. For a brief, precarious moment, Vlad III sat once again on the throne of Wallachia, reclaiming the crown that had been violently stripped from him 14 years earlier. Yet, this third and final reign was destined to be vastly different from his earlier years in power. The circumstances under which he returned left him with very little margin for error and an immense burden of responsibility. The Wallachia that Vlad inherited in his final return was economically strained, politically fractured, and encircled by powerful enemies who viewed his restoration as an intolerable provocation. Sultan Mehmed Roman II could not afford to let a defiant, anti-Ottoman ruler control the strategic Danubian frontier without a severe response. Furthermore, Vlad's reliance on King Matthias Corvinus meant that his sovereignty was heavily compromised. He was expected to coordinate his military actions with Hungarian interests and maintain constant vigilance against internal betrayals. The local boyars, who had survived decades of political turmoil, remained deeply suspicious of central authority and were quick to plot against any prince who threatened their privileges. Despite these overwhelming pressures, Vlad immediately set to work attempting to secure his borders and rebuild his defenses. He ordered the reinforcement of border fortifications, reorganized his military units, and sought to shore up alliances with neighboring Christian rulers, particularly Stephen of Moldavia. Every decision he made during this brief final period was marked by an intense urgency, as if he intuitively understood that his time was severely limited. The political landscape of Eastern Europe in the late 15th century was too unforgiving, and the coalition that had helped him return was too fragile to withstand a sustained counteroffensive by the full might of the Ottoman Empire. As the winter of 1476 approached, the atmosphere in Wallachia was thick with impending conflict. Scouts brought frequent reports of Ottoman troop movements gathering south of the Danube, preparing for a massive punitive expedition led by Sultan Mehmed Roman II and supported by rival factions within the region. Vlad's final return was rapidly evolving into a desperate race against time. He had achieved his lifelong ambition of returning to power, but the throne he had fought so hard to regain was perched precariously on the edge of a volcano. The stage was set for the final, tragic chapter of his turbulent life, where the aging prince would face his ultimate test on the battlefield, defending the borders of his homeland against an overwhelming tide. The inevitable storm broke in the late autumn of 1476. Sultan Mehmed Roman II, infuriated by the audacity of Vlad Roman III's return, and determined to reassert absolute Ottoman control over the Danubian frontier, unleashed a formidable military expedition against Wallachia. At the same time, regional rivals, including supporters of the deposed Basarab Leota and hostile elements among the local nobility, mobilized to crush the restored prince. Vlad found himself heavily outnumbered, facing enemies closing in from multiple directions with forces far superior to the meager coalition of Hungarian, Transylvanian, and loyalist troops he had managed to assemble. Yet, true to the uncompromising character that had defined his entire life, the aging prince refused to yield or seek terms. He prepared his remaining forces for a final, desperate confrontation, knowing that the survival of his principality and his own life hung in the balance. The exact details of Vlad III's final battle and death remain shrouded in mystery, obscured by conflicting contemporary accounts, political propaganda, and the chaos of medieval warfare. What historical records do confirm is that the clash occurred in December 1476, somewhere on the snowy, unforgiving terrain of Wallachia. As enemy forces advanced, Vlad led his troops out to meet them, engaging in fierce combat against overwhelming odds. According to some primary chroniclers, such as the contemporary writer Benfini, Vlad fell in the heat of battle, surrounded by his loyal guards after a desperate struggle against the encircling Ottoman and rival forces. Other accounts suggest that he may have been assassinated by treacherous boyars within his own camp, who feared the consequences of a prolonged war, or hoped to curry favor with the incoming regime. The profound confusion of the battlefield and the rapid collapse of his administration made it impossible to ascertain the exact sequence of his final moments. The fate of Vlad's body became the subject of immediate folklore and enduring historical debate. According to popular tradition passed down through generations, his enemies subjected his remains to a grim display, severing his head and sending it to Constantinople as a chilling trophy to satisfy Sultan-maimed Roman II, while his headless torso was reportedly buried quietly near a monastery, possibly at Snagov or Kolmana, though archaeological excavations have never definitively solved the mystery of his final resting place. This uncertainty only added to the mythic aura surrounding his death, transforming the fallen prince into a ghost-like figure in the collective memory of the region. For the common people of Wallachia, who had looked to him as a harsh protector against foreign domination, his sudden disappearance from the political stage felt less like a simple defeat and more like the end of an era defined by unyielding defiance. The death of Vlad III marked the definitive conclusion of a turbulent life, spent fighting for political survival and independence in one of Europe's most dangerous frontier zones. He left behind a fractured, exhausted land that quickly fell back under Ottoman suzerainty, as Basarab Leota and subsequent rulers resumed the familiar pattern of paying tribute to Istanbul. The grand coalition of Christian powers that had briefly supported Vlad's return quickly fractured as regional priorities shifted elsewhere. Yet, the impact of his final battle resonated far beyond the borders of Wallachia. By choosing to fight to the bitter end rather than capitulate to overwhelming force, Vlad cemented his reputation as an indomitable, if terrifying, warrior prince. His death closed the final chapter of his active political career, but it opened the door to a much larger, enduring afterlife in legend, literature, and history, where the boundary between the man and the myth would soon blur into shadow and immortality. The death of Vlad III on the snowy battlefield of Wallachia in 1476 did not bring an end to his story. Instead, it marked the beginning of his transformation from a mortal medieval prince into a legendary figure of terror and fascination. While the historical Vlad had fought desperately to defend his realm from Ottoman expansion and domestic betrayal, his actions left deep psychological scars on those who experienced or witnessed his reign. In the decades following his demise, stories about his brutal methods of justice, his absolute intolerance for crime and corruption, and his uncompromising defiance of foreign powers began to circulate far beyond the borders of his small principality. What started as whispered accounts among merchants, diplomats, and soldiers soon evolved into a widespread European phenomenon, captured in the emerging medium of the printing press. During the late 15th century, the newly invented printing press in Germany played a massive role in shaping the modern image of Vlad the Impaler. Merchants and travelers coming from Transylvania and Hungary brought back harrowing tales of the Wallachian ruler's punishments. Printers in Nuremberg, Vienna, and other Central European cities quickly realized that these sensational stories were commercial gold mines. They published small, inexpensive pamphlets known as Einblattdruck, which featured lurid accounts of Vlad's alleged atrocities alongside crude woodcut illustrations. These German stories portrayed him as a sadistic tyrant who delighted in torture and murder, detailing famous anecdotes such as the execution of lazy merchants, the punishment of deceitful nobles, and the legendary feast where he supposedly dined among rows of impaled victims. While many of these tales were heavily exaggerated, distorted by political bias, or entirely fabricated to entertain an eager public, they cemented a terrifying archetype in the European imagination. At the same time, a very different tradition of stories developed in the lands of the Russian Empire. Several Slavic manuscripts from the late 15th century presented Vlad in a more nuanced and complex light. These texts acknowledged his extreme cruelty, but framed it as a necessary evil imposed upon a lawless land. In these accounts, Vlad was depicted not merely as a bloodthirsty madman, but as a severe yet just sovereign who enforced absolute order, eradicated thievery, and punished corrupt nobles to protect the common people. The Slavic narratives emphasized that his harsh measures created a society so secure that a golden cup could be left unattended in the middle of a public square without fear of theft. This striking contrast between the Western German pamphlets, which condemned him as a monster, and the Eastern Slavic texts, which respected him as a stern defender of justice, highlights how quickly the historical figure fractured into multiple conflicting legends. Meanwhile, within the Ottoman Empire, the memory of Vlad III lived on through court chronicles and military recollections. Ottoman historians viewed him as a formidable and dangerous adversary who had humiliated Sultan-maimed Roman II forces during the campaign of 1462 and the daring night attack. To the Ottomans, Vlad was a rebellious vassal whose defiance required total subjugation, yet they also respected his military cunning and fearlessness in battle. These Turkish accounts contributed to the broader tapestry of oral and written folklore that followed the prince wherever his name was known, transforming him into a legendary Eastern bogeyman who haunted the borderlands of empires. As centuries passed, these diverse strands of German horror stories, Slavic folk tales, and Ottoman military chronicles blended together, slowly detaching the man from the myth. In Romanian folklore, the memory of Vlad evolved through oral tradition into something far more complex than the Western pamphlets suggested. While peasants were well aware of his terrifying punishments, many also remembered him as a strong national hero who stood up to foreign oppressors and protected the poor from corrupt boyars. This dual identity, part ruthless tyrant, part patriotic protector, allowed his legacy to endure in the collective memory of his homeland long after his physical remains had turned to dust. The gradual shift from historical reality to folklore paved the way for the ultimate literary metamorphosis. By the 19th century, the tales of the cruel Wallachian prince were sitting quietly in European libraries, waiting for the right creative spark to bring them into the realm of modern fiction. The combination of his ominous family name, Dracula, his association with the Order of the Dragon, his reputation for shedding blood, and the dark, mountainous landscapes of his former realm provided an irresistible palette of atmospheric elements. When authors and researchers began piecing these historical fragments together, they laid the vital groundwork for a fictional creation that would forever link the medieval Prince of Wallachia with the shadowy world of vampires, ensuring that Vlad's name would echo down through the ages, in ways he could never have possibly imagined. The final and most famous metamorphosis of Vlad Roman III occurred far from the rugged mountains of Wallachia, deep within the quiet, gaslit libraries and study rooms of late Victorian London. Here, an ambitious Irish author and theater manager named Bram Stoker began immersing himself in the dark folklore and obscure history of Eastern Europe. Stoker was not initially setting out to write a historical biography. Rather, he was searching for a powerful, terrifying antagonist for a new Gothic horror novel that would capture the anxieties of the late 19th century. In his quest for atmosphere, dread, and a suitably imposing historical anchor, Stoker stumbled upon the academic writings of travelers, historians, and diplomats who had collected tales of the ruthless Wallachian prince centuries earlier. As Stoker turned the pages of these old accounts, he found a treasure trove of atmospheric details, ominous geographic names, and a legacy drenched in fear, which would ultimately breathe life into the world's most famous vampire. To understand what Bram Stoker actually borrowed from the historical Vlad, one must look closely at the notes and research journals the author left behind, which are now preserved by scholars. Stoker did not write a book about the real medieval wars between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire, nor did he attempt to chronicle Vlad's political struggles against domestic boyars or Hungarian kings. Instead, Stoker extracted specific elements that suited his artistic vision, most notably the name itself. While reading William Wilkinson's 19th-century work, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, Stoker discovered a crucial linguistic note explaining that the surname Dracula meant devil in the local dialect of the region. To Stoker's imaginative mind, this translation was an absolute stroke of genius. He eagerly adopted the name for his aristocratic monster, recognizing that it carried an authentic historical weight, a ring of ancient danger, and a dark foreign allure that ordinary fictional names simply could not match. Beyond the name, Stoker borrowed fragments of Vlad's geographical and historical identity to anchor his fictional count in a specific, tangible reality. In the opening chapters of Dracula, the fictional count proudly boasts to his English solicitor guest, Jonathan Harker, about his glorious ancestry, explicitly invoking his royal lineage and his people's fierce battles against invading empires. Dracula speaks directly of the voivode Dracula who crossed the Danube and beat the Turks on their own ground, echoing the very real military campaigns of Vlad Roman III against Sultan Mehmed Roman II. Stoker even embedded specific historical references into the dialogue, having the Count mention how his noble family shed their blood for their faith and country on the dangerous frontiers of Christendom. By weaving these authentic historical threads into the fabric of a supernatural narrative, Stoker lent his fictional creation a chilling sense of historical authenticity, making readers feel as though the ancient horrors of the Carpathians were rooted in actual past events. However, it is vital to separate what Stoker took from Vlad the Impaler from what he drew from broader Gothic literature, folklore, and his own vivid imagination. The historical Vlad Roman III was a mortal man of flesh and bone, a medieval prince fighting political survival wars with steel, fire, and political cunning. He was never associated with vampirism, immortality, bats, coffins, or the supernatural during his lifetime, nor did the 16th century German and Slavic pamphlets ever accuse him of drinking blood or rising from the dead. Those macabre traits came instead from centuries of European superstition, folklore regarding restless corpses, and the rich traditions of Gothic fiction that preceded Stoker's work, ranging from John Polidori's The Vampire to Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Stoker synthesized these eerie motifs with various unrelated pieces of Eastern European lore, creating a composite creature that blended European vampire mythology with the ruthless reputation of a real historical tyrant. Another significant element that Stoker borrowed and adapted was the atmospheric landscape of Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains. Although Vlad III ruled Wallachia, whose capital and power centers lay south of the mountains, Stoker chose to place his fictional castle high in the remote, mist-shrouded peaks of Transylvania, near the Borgo Pass. Stoker meticulously researched the geography of the region using travel guides and maps available in the British Library, filling his notebook with foreign place names, local customs, and descriptions of jagged ravines, howling wolves, and looming forests. This obsessive attention to geographical detail allowed him to paint a vivid, claustrophobic picture of an isolated frontier where modern civilization abruptly ends and ancient, primeval terrors begin. The rugged terrain where the historical Vlad once marched his armies thus became transformed into the brooding, atmospheric domain of an immortal predator. As Bram Stoker's novel was published in 1897 and slowly grew into a cultural phenomenon, an irreversible fusion took place in the global imagination. The historical prince, whose real life was defined by the harsh political realities of 15th-century Europe, became permanently overshadowed by the towering, cape-wearing figure of fiction. For generations of readers and moviegoers, the name Dracula ceased to evoke a medieval Wallachian warlord fighting for his throne, and instead conjured images of fangs, moonlight, and nocturnal terror. Yet, despite this massive fictional transformation, the shadow of the real Vlad always lingers behind the myth. The fascination with Count Dracula ultimately drives millions of curious minds back to the true history, ensuring that the turbulent life, fierce independence, and unyielding severity of Vlad the Impaler continue to be studied, debated, and remembered centuries after his final battle in the snow. The final chapter of this long and turbulent history brings us to a complex conclusion, where the boundary between historical truth and enduring myth blurs into a single, fascinating legacy. When we look back across the centuries at Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, we see a ruler who defies simple categorization. He was neither a pure monster nor a noble saint, but a product of his violent and unforgiving era. Operating on a dangerous political frontier where small nations were constantly squeezed between expanding empires and shifting alliances, Vlad used extreme severity as a deliberate tool to secure his state, enforce internal order, and resist foreign domination. His methods were brutal, and his reign was defined by ruthless acts of terror designed to shock his enemies and cow his domestic rivals. Yet, to reduce Vlad the Impaler solely to a cruel tyrant is to misunderstand the geopolitical realities of 15th-century Eastern Europe. In his own time, he was viewed by many as a fierce defender of his homeland, a Christian prince holding the line against the overwhelming advance of the Ottoman Empire when larger powers failed to act. The harsh laws he imposed and the ruthless punishments he carried out were meant to create absolute order in a land torn apart by civil war and noble treason. While his methods shocked foreign travelers and inspired a wave of hostile propaganda leaflets in Germany and beyond, they also earned him a reputation for unyielding justice among certain segments of the population who valued security above all else. He lived and died a medieval warrior prince, fighting desperately for the survival and sovereignty of his principality. Today, the historical reality of Vlad III is forever intertwined with the fictional creation of Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. This blending of fact and fiction has created one of the most powerful and enduring cultural phenomena in human history, Millions of people around the world know the name Dracula, yet few realize that a real flesh-and-blood ruler walked the earth behind that legendary moniker. The transformation from a 15th-century Wallachian voivode into a supernatural creature of the night shows how human storytelling can take historical fragments and spin them into timeless myth. The Gothic imagery of 19th-century literature, combined with centuries of dark European folklore, completely reshaped how the world perceives the prince, turning a political struggle for survival into a supernatural tale of eternal dread. Despite this massive fictional shadow, the true history of Vlad the Impaler continues to captivate historians, researchers, and curious travelers from every corner of the globe. Scholars tirelessly comb through archives in Romania, Hungary, Turkey, and Germany to uncover new documents, letters, and diplomatic reports that shed light on his actual life, policies, and military campaigns. Tourists flock to the rugged landscapes of the Carpathian Mountains, visiting ancient fortresses like Ponari Castle and historical sites associated with his name, searching for the tangible remnants of a medieval world that feel both alien and strangely compelling. The fascination with Vlad's life stems from our deep human desire to understand the extremes of human behavior, power, and survival. Ultimately, Vlad the Impaler remains one of the most remarkable and controversial figures of the European Middle Ages, because he forces us to confront the harsh choices forced upon leaders in times of existential crisis. He was a man of his time, fierce, unyielding, deeply flawed, and profoundly shaped by the betrayals and dangers of his youth. Whether viewed as a patriotic defender of his realm or a cruel and merciless warlord, his story endures as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit under impossible pressure. Centuries after his final battle in the snowy forests of Wallachia, the legacy of Vlad III lives on, proving